Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming to this what proves to be a very interesting and informative event. It's part of our series, Conversations on AI and our data-driven society. Today's panel discussion is AI in healthcare. I'm Janet Bloom, and Deputy Provost, and it's my pleasure to kick off this event. Throughout this series, we've talked about the reach and impact of AI from many different perspectives, including ownership, privacy, and equity considerations. And today's topic, AI in healthcare, I think hits home for everybody. We can all relate to healthcare, and as consumers, providers, researchers, whatever we may be. The question of how AI will shape the future of healthcare is one that we'll think a little bit about today. And is this the new normal? AI has a lot of potential, of course, and much of it's being realized everywhere from education to research, the development of diagnostics and treatment, the keeping of records, analyzing of records, policies, all kinds of things. And all of this happens very quickly and raises all kinds of questions around ethics, privacy, and the speed at which we move ahead in this realm. I will be turning it over to our moderator of this panel discussion, Professor Sohini Ramachandran, Director of Brown's Data Science Institute, the Herman C. Bumpus Professor of Biology and Data Science, and Professor of Computer Science. Sohini will introduce our awesome panelists and lead off the discussion. We'll be taking your questions through a QR code, and we'll have a question and answer period at the end. So as we go along, you'll have an opportunity to submit through a QR code, which we'll put up here. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Sohini to introduce our amazing panelists. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a delight to work with the Provost's office on this series of conversations, and I think this is going to be a really vibrant one today. So I'm going to introduce each of my colleagues to my left here, and after I say your name and your amazing titles, you have such diverse and amazing roles that you play, I would love for you to start us off in an optimistic place. If you look ahead to the future, what is a kind of dream scenario for the integration of AI into healthcare from the perspective of your own research? So first, I'll introduce Hamish Fraser. Hamish is a faculty member in the Brown Center for Biomedical Informatics, Associate Professor of Medical Science, and Associate Professor of Health Services Policy and Practice. So would you like to go ahead and answer that question, Hamish?
And then, I'd be happy to. So I've been interested in diagnosis and improving quality diagnosis for most of my career. And we've seen over the years lots of different research trying to develop systems that would help physicians and nurses and nurse practitioners, for example, to improve diagnosis. And it was very slow to get going. Then about 10 years ago, we suddenly saw sort of the wealth of apps coming out that people would use to actually diagnose themselves in an unsupervised sort of home setting, like symptom checkers. And I started looking at these and thinking, so there's a really important potential to find ways of helping people maybe have an urgent problem to recognize it and get to hospital quickly. But I wonder if they work properly. And a lot of my work is very much about how do you apply really practical real-world examples and scenarios to see if these things work. So my hope is that in the next few years, as we see more progress, and large language models have made exciting steps forward, but we'll talk about some of the to and fro's about that later. But if those systems, really get as good as we'd hope they would be, then people will be able to actually get accurate diagnosis and advice about what to do in a home setting, and that will actually make a huge difference to some of the most important diseases like heart attacks and strokes and cancer diagnosis, where people often don't recognize the problem until too late, and we can't really treat them effectively.
Okay, next we have Lauren Crawford, who's a faculty member in the Center for Computational Molecular Biology in the Data Science Institute, Associate Professor of Biostatistics, and a Senior Scientist at Microsoft Research.
Hi everyone, Lauren Crawford. My research is primarily on this idea of how to build interpretable machine learning models to understand how non-additive variations, you can think about things like how our genes interact with each other or how our genes interact with our environment, and how those interactions play a role in complex traits and diseases. I think about that on the basis of regular traits like height and body mass index, and thinking about when those interactions are the same or when they differ, how that affects our ability to do precision medicine really well. Primarily, I've been thinking about this question a lot in cancer genomics recently. So you can think about this world where we have these cool technologies now, or these things called organoids. You can imagine where you have a cancer patient that gets a biopsy. You can take those cells and sequence those cells, and that's like an in vivo representation of what's happening in the body. Or I can take those cells, put them in a dish, grow those cells out, and create what we call an organoid, which is effectively almost like a synthetic simulation of what that tumor looks like outside the body. And you can imagine how great that would be if that recapitulates everything in the person, because I can try treatment strategies outside of the body, right? And so my hope is that things like AI will be able to be used to close this gap between what you see in vivo and ex vivo, and then be able to predict what treatment strategies might be helpful, be able to predict when things like therapeutic resistance might occur, and be able to generalize across like all populations of people effectively.
And we also have Claire Wardle, who is co-founder and co-director of the Information Futures Lab, professor of the practice of health services policy and practice.
Lauren, I'm sitting on an AI panel and I'm already optimistic. That never happens. So a lot of my work is based on working with communities and partnering with communities to understand their needs. And so in the AI healthcare space, I'm really excited about what it would look like. I mean, I'm a British person. I find it very difficult to navigate your healthcare system. And so I think a lot about how AI will improve people's access to personalized care regimes, will help them navigate. Even patient portals will have in real-time translation and content that's trusted. But that's what we're going to talk more about, is how do we build those systems with communities now, so what we're building will end up being systems that people trust. But I'm really interested in improving health literacy and access to information so people feel empowered to make decisions about their own health and safety.
Yeah, so thanks, thank you all. And Claire, that's a great point for us to start with, is the work of the Information Futures Lab, which is this amazing group in the School of Public Health that investigates the harms of misinformation and the information ecosystem that we all live in. But I want you to tell us a little bit about how you and the lab think about misinformation as it relates to our health and our health care.
Yeah, so as you know, there's a lot of health misinformation out there, and AI is making it even easier. If I want to cause division and cause fear, everything else, health is a really good thing to do that around. So on one hand, we have to build resilience with communities to help them identify that. But we're also doing work right now with communities on exactly as I was saying, when people have questions about their health and safety, if they go asking those questions to chatbots or voice-activated assistants like Alexa, what makes them trust the answers that they get? Because there's a lot of literature out there around the ways in which AI chatbots have been used for health promotion strategies or information seeking, but it's always, is the information accurate? And what we know from the misinformation crisis is you can give people factual information, they're like, but that goes against my existing worldview, so I'm going to deny that. Like, we know that facts often aren't enough. So what we're interested in studying is what elements of this make people trust the information they receive from these spaces. And sometimes we hear people say, I love asking Alexa because she sounds like she knows what she's talking about. And it's true, we want to giggle about that, but that actually, when people go, I go to Google and it gives me 3 million results, I don't have time and I don't have the expertise to navigate that. I would much rather have Alexa tell me what I should do. So a lot of this is understanding how people interact with these systems and what makes them trust or not trust this information. Otherwise, we're going to repeat all the mistakes that we've so far made with social media by not bringing the communities into these conversations. Because for all of these AI panels that we sit on, it's almost never do we have somebody from the community sitting here talking about the way they navigate these spaces, right? And we can't have multi-stakeholder conversations about AI unless we bring communities themselves to these tables.
Mm-hmm. Hamish, you're a physician by training,
Yes.
and you've been studying how ChatGPT versions perform at diagnosis and triage of patients. So could you tell us a little bit about what that looks like, how that what your results have been, and how you foresee AI influencing clinical decision-making processes in the future?
Sure. So one of the things that we decided to do with the symptom checker apps was to figure out what patients could actually do with them, and when they used an app, for example, when they were waiting for emergency care in the Rhode Island Hospital ED or urgent primary care, and they used the app, and then we compared the results of the app in terms of diagnosis and triage with what the actual decision with the physician who saw the patient was. Could we actually see whether they were working effectively and were they safe? And so we started that with an app from a company called Ada Health in Germany, which is one of the best symptom checker apps from the previous research that people have done. And that was reasonably effective, and we compared that with physicians actually just reviewing the same clinical data that Ada had collected. But then along comes ChatGPT, and we thought, well, we're actually quite well positioned to try and figure out whether this is a good thing or not. And so we have another study we're just finishing analyzing, which has 201 patients from emergent primary care, and then we had 40 patients from the ED. And so we used ChatGPT 3.5 and 4, and we just essentially looked at the output in terms of diagnosis and triage and what recommendations it made for people, and then compared that with two other symptom checker apps, so Ada and WebMD, and also the primary care physicians, independent physicians reading the data. And so what we found was that ChatGPT was amazingly good at some things and really pretty scary at other things, and it was very hard to know which one it was going to be. And so, for example, 3.5 was great at diagnosis, and it was really unsafe for triage in the emergency department. It actually would diagnose a myocardial infarction or a head injury correctly, and then say, oh, routine care is fine. So that was a problem. And then we tried the same thing with the primary care data. It wouldn't work very well. We had to play around with the prompts and design new prompts for the system. But eventually, we got some very good results in diagnosis, but it's still very, very variable. And so I thought, well, this is getting better. I wonder if it's the data, if it's the prompt, or if it's the algorithms got better. So I went back and tested that head injury case again, and none of the versions of ChatGPT or the prompts could persuade it to diagnose head injury. So I was like, that's interesting. So I think we have a very powerful, amazing tool which does incredible things. And I think there are times when I believe that, even now ChatGPT can find these sort of rare diagnoses that are very hard for other people to find, or for other systems to find, I should say. But at the same time, it's very hard to know what you're going to get. And we know, for example, that in some studies, people have entered the exact same case from an emergency department record 3 times in the same day, and the diagnosis agreed 60% of the time. That was a year ago. Maybe it's different now. So I think we have a long way to go, and we really need to think very hard about how do we build these very, very realistic clinical evaluations and not use any kind of made-up data, any kind of medical boards, anything that's kind of written and organized in a way that the large language model may have been trained on, but actually the kind of patient data that people are really going to need answers for.
Claire, I wonder if what Hamish is saying, how that makes you think about your community-based work and what the experience is of somebody maybe asking the same question to either different platforms or the same platform and getting different answers on different queries. And
yeah, well, I just wanted to add to what you were just saying, Hamish, which is there's been some interesting work done around chatbots and election questions, like, can I wear a MAGA hat when I go voting? And then they cross-reference with secretaries of state. And what they found was it was 52% inaccurate, but they sounded really authoritative. So to your point, like you're saying it was 48% wrong, but when you're reading it, you have it sounds like it knows what it's talking about. But to your point, Sahini, when we're in the middle of our research right now, when we would ask somebody to come up with a question, and it's almost always, my 80-year-old mother has just been diagnosed with this new prescription, is it safe? Like it's so fascinating. That's what people have their number one question about. And then when they ask, we ask them to search on Google, and then to search on either Siri or Alexa, and then to search on often, we give them options, but they often choose OpenAI and ChatGPT, and they can see the differences. But they're also interested in how often Siri will say, you should go here, like it will send you to another link. So with ChatGPT, we've often had people say, oh, can you download that onto my phone afterwards? So people like chat because it often says, I'm sorry to hear that you're struggling with this. So the empathy piece is there, which people like. Then it sounds authoritative and it's explaining it all. You don't have to go and do it yourself. So it's interesting when people then have that direct comparison of answer, how much they're drawn towards what GPT seems to be providing them. And it goes back, when you say, how do you know if this is true or not? They're like, oh, I suppose I could go and Google it, but that's like, I'm going back to the beginning, right? So there's this sense of, I just want to be told what's right. So yeah, I've been quite surprised how drawn towards ChatGPT people are, but I think also because we're at a university, we have lots of critical conversations with our students about, the bias that's inherent in these models. And like, we're talking all the time about critical ways of thinking about AI. When we're having these conversations with community members, they're like, well, I've heard about this thing, like they often don't even know how to pronounce it. And then they'll say, but I don't know what it is at all. And so I also have these like issues as we're doing this research, that this is often the first time somebody has interacted with it at all, to their knowledge, right? Then at the end, we kind of have a debrief about, are you aware about how mortgage companies are often making decisions about your mortgage based on similar types of things? So what we're also seeing is that this research becomes like an inroad to start these conversations with communities who really haven't been part of these conversations at all. So yeah, I wish, now that we're doing it, I kind of wish we'd gone back earlier and done things in the last couple of years with communities about the impact of AI more generally. There's been all this journalism around it, but again, a failure to interact with communities themselves.
Yeah, this makes me think about our colleague here at Brown, Malik Boykin, the cognitive scientist who's worked a lot on AI literacy with communities and trying to just help people understand what models are actually doing when they're computing probabilities. And I know, Lauren, you think about that too. I think part of what you're touching on is that healthcare literacy itself is its own kind of question, right? But then also using that as a portal into AI literacy might be a really amazing opportunity. I wonder,
Yeah,
Lauren, what you think
I think about
that?
this question with Malik a lot. Like you wonder like how privileged sometimes we are in this space because we're introduced to these models a lot. And I think about my parents sometimes when they ask me like, what is it that you do? And I'm like, oh, I worked with this model, and I recognize how little they understand what's happening on the other side of that. So like, my lab is here, so they're gonna, sorry about my soapbox, and I have a stage to do this, where, how a machine is able to make discoveries sometimes is based on these hallucinations, right? So a well-calibrated AI system every so once in a while makes an outlandish prediction, but that's how it's able to find out something new. It has to have the ability to do that thing. And so we understand that like within reason, some of these hallucinations are actually kind of a good thing because it means it's working within some calibration that us as statisticians and data scientists all kind of understand. But the outside person, you think about that, like the ability to understand what it is that system is doing, and then you think about certain communities that already have distrust across healthcare systems, and
100%.
what that means then when you add another element that they also don't understand, how that further exacerbates some of these issues. And so, yeah, I think thinking about not only ways to improve healthcare literacy, but we're going to start to have programs that also introduces AI literacy as well. I think it's going to be super important. And you're going to have to bring people in who are not just in one field to do this. You're going to need people like the Maliks and others to help think about how to touch these communities. And I think that's an area of research that is going to be highly important moving forward.
Actually, a comment to sort of follow on for a couple of those things. So Dave de Bronkart is a guy who's often goes by the moniker of e-patient Dave, and for a number of years after he was diagnosed with cancer and had to navigate the health system, he's been working with lots of groups to look at the way you can use digital tools to get help with diagnosis and management and side effects of treatments and so on, working with some colleagues at Harvard Medical School. So he was giving a presentation on a panel at AMIA meeting about a month ago in Boston, and I brought out some of these concerns about ChatGPT, and he was felt very strongly, that people who are stuck without finding out what's wrong with them, and they've had all these investigations and they've not got the answers, that ChatGPT has had some really great examples where it's found rare diagnoses or problems that weren't recognized before. And so we sort of got into a bit of a to and fro about that, and I was like, well, but what happens when it goes wrong? And so I think there are these scenarios where even now, if you have been fully worked up and you still don't know the answer, then that's probably good data to feed into a large language model. And maybe it comes up with this crazy idea, but one of them is actually a really good one, and that's okay. But on the other hand, if you suddenly develop some weakness in your left side or you have this central chest pain, I wouldn't encourage you to have a system that's going to make something up or not recognize it. So I guess that's the problem, that we need both the creativity piece, which is obviously very beneficial sometimes in research because lots of smart people are looking at it. And then when you have communities and patients who don't have medical training or digital literacy isn't very high, that's where the concern comes in, I think. And we sort of, there have been some studies done, for example, looking at people Googling diagnoses and sort of what decisions to make about their healthcare as part of a study of 3,000 patients. And when they asked people what were they going to do about this, what was the diagnosis for this particular description, and then they got a couple of hours to Google it, their diagnosis was slightly more accurate, but their decision, their triage was no better. So it may be that large language models are actually better at helping people to make the right decision. but we don't know that yet.
And also, just to jump in, the work I'm doing is basically with one of our students. I don't think he's here, but who is a Chinese American student, and he's doing a lot of his interviews with his community. And so a lot of what he's finding is, of course, a lot of these models are based very much on Western medicine, right? So asking questions around different types of supplements or different types of health behaviors. And of course, his community are like, nope. And then other people in our side are like, oh yes, St. John's Wort for depression. Like just some of those things about how to the point about unsettled science, things like Lyme disease or long COVID or places where we do not have consensus around treatment or whatever. Yeah. I think, what does that mean when people are like, I just want the one answer? It's like, science doesn't always have the one answer. So that, to me, like that challenge of what do these language models have to say to people to say there isn't consensus on this? Mm-hmm. And how do people take that when actually certainty, which is why conspiracy theories are so compelling, certainty feels a lot more positive than ambiguity of like, we need more research. Like that doesn't feel good unless you're us.
Yeah. Well, and just the problem of attribution to of the results that are being given by a chatbot, right? And that's something that can be, we recently in my lab were submitting queries to different chatbots, and some of them would say, this comes from Wikipedia. They all gave the same answer, but some of them were citing Wikipedia and some weren't, and that was kind of interesting to see.
It's cute on the new WhatsApp has a chatbot, and in that they kind of have footnotes, and then they link to their footnotes. So that's kind of like, oh, hello. So yeah, it's fascinating to see all the different ways they're coming with their attribution.
Just a quick follow-on comment. So training as a physician in the UK and doing the medical boards, the membership of the Royal College of Physicians, which was extremely brutal. Probably one of the hardest board exams you can do. One of the things they said, you have to be confident of your answer. You're like, well, I'm not quite sure about that. You have to be confident and give a clear answer because then people will trust you, which is great up to a point. And I remember thinking at the time, there's a downside to this. So I guess it's not entirely different from the way we interact with physicians, where sometimes people do give you a very strong answer, and in fact it isn't the correct one. And so knowing when you actually don't know is one of the key things we need to teach the machines as well.
Sure.
So Lauren, I want you to take us to thinking about large language models in a kind of different way, which is foundation models on the molecular scale, which is something that you work on. Yeah. So maybe you could sort of introduce the idea for us, but also how you see these models playing a role in automated decision-making in a healthcare setting.
Yeah, so just for the broad audience, so foundation models are basically this idea of, the same thing, like a language model is able to generalize to other domain and context. Foundation models in biology is kind of the similar thing, right? Like you can think about anything from, can I generate data that looks like gene expression in one tissue in a given disease state that I haven't actually observed yet, right? Can I predict how a protein might conform if I haven't seen that mutation yet, those kind of things. Biology is interesting because we're always 4 steps behind the rest of other areas of data science. I think a lot of that comes from technology. Again, sorry to my lab because they're here. They hear me say this all the time. The reason why we're behind, I think, is because, in language, what we're doing now, this is training data that you're seeing up there, and you can use that all the time. And you can think about in a sentence, I think, if I take a comma and I move that comma from one area of the sentence to another, we all kind of understand how the context of that sentence has changed. But we don't have that same kind of viewpoint in many areas of biology. If I take a cell and I perturb it in a given way, I don't really know what that means in terms of disease state, right? Because that data just doesn't exist yet. And so I think we're in a point in biology where we're trying to understand how much data do we actually need in order to start to generalize quite well. And how much of this can we rely on a single modality, so one type of measurement, so things like gene expression, imaging, and how much do I need to think about other new modalities that just don't exist yet? And so I think biology is in this interesting place where we're really trying to figure a lot of that out. Again, getting on my soapbox, I think data is the most important thing when it comes to these models. I think places like OpenAI have been open about this, where the data is kind of the secret sauce that makes these things go. And so at some point, I think you're gonna hit this asymptotic relationship where you have a large model, and that's fine, but it's the type of data that you put in it that's going to allow it to make the AI go. And so I think in bio, we're really trying to figure out how modalities talk across one another, and also trying to figure out what tasks matter. I've also recognized, if I probably ask my lab in general, what would you want a foundation model to do? I think all 8 to 10 of them would give me different answers. And so when it comes to training these types of models, what are we expecting a foundation model to be able to do in biology is another open question. And I think we're all trying to think those things through. Yeah.
Claire, I was wondering if you could just illustrate a little more to us about the community-based work you've been doing and some of the blind spots that exist today in health literacy and AI through the work that you're doing on the ground.
Yeah, so I think I'll start by, you introduced me and said, I study misinformation, which is true. I've been doing this work for about 20 years. But about 3 years ago, I realized that we've been so busy focused on the worst of the worst, because in many ways it's easier to blame others. Like it's easier to blame the idea of like trolls and bots and bad actors, as opposed to the failings of institutions to provide good information to people when they need it, right? So I do a lot of work now with government agencies and newsrooms and others to say, are you really listening to your communities and the questions and concerns that they have? And are you effectively providing useful answers back to people that they can use? And so that to me is when we think about AI and other systems, it goes back to that. How are we really effectively listening to communities and ensuring that we're giving them information in ways that they could use? So that's why I sort of have some optimism about, for example, translation. Like, Rhode Island is incredibly diverse. If you go onto the Rhode Island Department of Health website, they're doing a pretty good job, but it's very hard to really reach a number of communities in language that makes sense to them with messengers that they trust. And so I think there are real opportunities here with the work that we do if we partner with communities now to really co-create these kind of technologies with them and to think ahead of time what some of those unintended consequences are. But I do think the opportunities here around health literacy or trust. I mean, I think to your point, Hamish, I find it hilarious that British doctors were told just to be certain. And I think many of you know this. There's recent research that shows that actually people, when they're given communication by real human doctors versus AI systems, find the AI systems more empathetic. And so what does that look like?
One study.
One study needs to be replicated. But what that to me is, I'm a communication scholar. Like that to me is we focus so much on accuracy, and that's what a lot of the auditing work is done around AI. Is this an accurate model? But we're really bad at understanding what elements of that model will make somebody trust the information. And also bad actors. Like I can make a really empathetic chatbot that sounds authoritative and just give all of the wrong information. So we've also got to think about how can we red team, which is like how can we, do scenario planning about how some of this technology could be used by bad actors, but also how can we really think at basic principles, what is it that people are lacking now when they interact with the healthcare system? And there's a ton of ways that people are lacking in good information when they get that. And we know this too. There was just another some research out about when people are diagnosed with Alzheimer's, the number one thing the family wants is like the Alzheimer's guide, the person that helps a family think about the new care regimes and not just what, prescriptions to take, but all the other things. And you think about, well, what would that look like as AI becomes more personalized? But how do we also ensure that we don't rush to do this in a way that's going to actually break down or there's going to be unintended consequences? And my concern about a number of the big platforms is, as I see them just release these new technological advances, it just feels like FOMO at the moment, and we have no guardrails. And I think, and I'm sure Hamish, you can talk about this too, but to me, I'm very much worried about the election. To me, there should be no election information on any AI system right now, like any chatbot. Like they should just say, we can't provide the guardrails. We are not going to provide any election-related material this year, right? And I think the same with the idea that I can go onto these symptom checkers and like, am I having a heart attack? And you're telling me that 50% of the time it's wrong. From a regulatory perspective, I just don't think it's ready for consumption yet. So that to me, it's like, I feel like there's real optimism for what we could do, but I'm terrified by the absence of really good systems and processes for ensuring that we're not making mistakes. That in 5 years' time, we'll sit on a panel and be like, oh, you know what we should have done? Like, we know what we should be doing. We're just not doing it right now because the market is leading these advances.
Can I ask a question and steal your role for like 2 seconds? Is Rhode Island a place where you can do that? Because it seems like everything here is on a smaller scale. You can at least have policymakers that talk to these different sectors. It seems like this needs to be a multi-sector type study. Are you able to do that here in a way that you can't do that in other places?
Yeah, some of you might know this, but Rhode Island has health equity zones, has 13 health equity zones, and they also exist in Chicago. But they're a real attempt to say, what does it look like if we do very kind of zip code based work on different health equity issues. And it's an incredible model, and the people behind it are just doing wonderful things. So yeah, when we do work in Rhode Island, it feels really exciting to me because I think there is an opportunity that would not exist in New York or California.
That makes sense.
So I think it's interesting that, obviously large language models are a very new technology, particularly in the use of healthcare. And so we have seen a lot of these really interesting possibilities. But in the work we've done with the earlier symptom checkers, which are the older, like Bayes nets and sort of more predictable algorithms that behave in a more understood way, they actually don't miss the diagnosis of heart attacks. At least the 3 we tested were 100% sensitive to picking out the heart attacks, but they had enormous false positive rates.
Yeah.
So that was the problem. So they were logically trying to make sure it was safe, but in fact, in reality, it would end up being unusable in that context because everyone would show up in the ED if they listened to it, and if they don't listen to it, well, then you've lost your point. So it's interesting, and what we really need, of course, is a mix of these two types of technologies, and there are a few early stages of that, but it seems like we have a long way to go because, if you get your result, you really also want something else that's saying, wait a minute, if you have a diagnosis like that, then the triage says it must be something else. And that's what's interesting is you can see these illogical pieces where, the model can come up with a very good answer for one piece and then a completely incompatible answer for the other piece, and there's no real catching of that. But it says it very clearly and authoritatively.
Yeah.
And so that's a bit of another concern from my point of view. Although in theory, we should be able to build tools that pick that up.
Yeah.
I wonder, Hamish, if you could talk to us from the other side about the concept of trust that Clara's brought up and what trust looks like in a clinical setting for a clinician at this point with AI, or what you think might need to be in place for physicians to also trust these systems and incorporate them into their work.
I mean, the problem is similar. Obviously, physicians and more experienced healthcare workers will have a lot of understanding and background, so they would be better able to identify potential problems. But the paradigm that's being pushed at the moment is, the physician will be responsible for making sure that the large language model or whatever system is not making a mistake. Mm-hmm. And that, in fact, is extremely difficult to do, even with older systems. But when you have a system that might have enormous amount of data going into it, you can't cross-check that. And so either you waste a lot of time trying to figure out where did they get this answer from, or you just say, well, it seems to be okay last time, and we follow that. So I think it's creating a very difficult situation where the expectation is not only unrealistic, but it's really dangerous because we simply can't have back check something so complex. So therefore, we need to be in a situation where the systems are tested and they're retested so that there is some real sense as to the reliability and the probability of a problem that we can rely on, but also. It's pretty clear in our research over the last year and a bit that we're dealing with constantly changing versions of the models, but nobody's really telling us much about that. And sometimes they get better and sometimes they get worse. And that is, historically in our field, you were never allowed to change the underlying model when you were doing a study because, of course, it would mess up the study. But we're ending up dealing with this all the time. And so we really don't know, are we getting a better version or a worse version, or is it going to be different next week? So that is a very big trust issue from my point of view. At least I'd like to know it's still, version 1.8.3. And if it's not, well, then I should assume that something might have changed. But we're not even easily seeing that as well. So I think also the whole notion that you have this very clear and very kind of readable text is very helpful in lots of ways, and obviously makes it much easier to use that information. But again, as Claire says, it can create this sort of false level of trust. Whereas, if something's a bit more threadbare and you have to think about it, that's probably safer because you've actually had to think.
Can I also ask a question? Because being very British, so I'm not going to name the company. But one of the symptom checkers, when I went to because I spoke to you and I got a bit obsessed by them. So I went in and I put in I did a pretend, am I having a heart attack?
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, how is it making money? Because there's no ads on this site. So I was like, how's it making money? So then I went and poked around and realized that in tiny letters it said, we're sucking up all of your data. And I was like, of course it is. They want to know my age and my weight. And so, yeah, I think that element of trust too, for how people understand what's driving. I don't know if you know much about that, but I was kind of surprised.
I don't fully understand the business model, which is also a concern, though. The company in question is actually a reasonably good one, I think. And we do have access to some of their stroke data, which has been very interesting. And we've learned lots of things like when you're using a symptom checker, a quarter of the time, if the symptoms might be stroke, it's somebody else other than the patient who's entering the data. and that person's usually a bit younger than the patient, and sometimes if it's a pediatric problem, they're usually a bit older. So you can sort of see this shadow, if you like, of the family interactions going on in the way people use them, which is interesting. So there's a lot of interesting detail like that in the background. Quite how they monetize it, though, is an interesting question.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure like the rest of the internet, it's data collection and selling.
But who buys it? That's the problem.
Lots and lots of people
Yeah.
who then target you with ads later.
Yeah, that's that old chestnut. If the product is unclear, then we are the product, right? And that's
100%.
that's sort of interesting when you think about how that interfaces with a diagnostic setting, for example, or an emergency.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't the New York Times. I'm giving them very personal information and how are they collecting it and how are they going to use it later and sell it to an insurance company that won't give me health insurance because I've told them that I've smoked, all of that stuff.
Yeah, so maybe going back to Lauren's question as moderator, co-moderator with me, about things, about things that are unique about Rhode Island. I wonder, Hamish, could you tell us a little more about the research alignment that's happening in the healthcare system here in the state and
Sure.
the promise of that for research in AI and healthcare?
Well, as we discussed, Rhode Island is very good in many ways in health data. We have the Rhode Island Quality Institute, which is one of the leading health information exchanges. And pretty much all of the electronic health record in data in Rhode Island is accessible from that one system, and you have to give consent. But I think it's only the private urgent care centers that for some reason don't participate in that. But you mean you have a very large and clear picture across 1.2, maybe 1.5 million patients who come through Rhode Island hospitals and health facilities. And that gives us a really interesting ability to sort of see across a whole range of different ways that people interact with the health system. And I think you see that with smaller states, and both in the US and around the world, that they can actually do better some ways than larger states, where the sort of the scale is much more difficult to accommodate. The sort of permissions across countries of 50 or 100 million people are much more difficult to negotiate. But one of the challenges, of course, is that we have the Brown University and all the research that's going on here, but also the two hospital systems. And there have been several attempts to figure out how we can actually bring those together and more effectively collaborate, so that as well as the health data, we can actually share a lot of the research studies and the ability to carry out research across all sorts of different organizations. And so Birch is an important step forward in this process, and it's busy being put together at the moment, so that we should be seeing more, for example, combined use of the IRB, the ethics committees, and more effective ways of being able to share data between different hospitals and Brown in secure ways, which currently can be a bit challenging because they all have their own different systems. And so, some of the most effective places doing research are these combined academic research centers where the teaching hospitals and the university are very much integrated in the way they're handling the research. And so we haven't quite got that, but this is a very big step in that direction. So I'm excited to see that hopefully the next year we'll see the benefits of that coming to fruition.
Wonderful. So I think we'll start transitioning to our Q&A portion of, and there will be a QR code that goes up where you can submit questions, which Janet's going to help moderate for us. But yeah, so maybe I could I can kick it off while people are entering in questions to ask you one that was submitted during registration, which is, what are some skills that students today who are interested in the interface of AI and healthcare should be trying to get while they're here at Brown? Who wants to start? Lauren, I'm going to make you start.
Okay. I have a lot of thoughts on this. Well, 'cause I don't think it should be exclusive, right? To me, any skill is useful in this space because, right, you've heard a lot of different problems that we're all having. There are technical challenges, which from a computer science perspective is, understanding the way algorithms work. Statistics is like a big thing, like understanding probabilities, right? And being able to interpret those things. But also like communication, right? Because there's a part of this where the models stop and people start, right? And so being able to actually communicate these to different populations is a big thing. And so to me, sitting at this intersection, like these interdisciplinary things, which I think obviously students at Brown just naturally do, thinking about, having this basis in computer science and statistics is always a really good thing. Not saying you have to be an expert in them, understand these systems, but I think communication is a massive thing, right? This idea of, I think where ML has always fallen short, even before the AI craze, is this idea of really being able to talk to communities to get the person outside of the expertise to understand what these systems are doing, how they're making predictions, communicating uncertainty in a way that people can then use that to inform their own decisions. So to me, that communication piece is also a really massive thing.
Other thoughts?
You go, Hamish.
Okay, sure. So one of the things that I focus a lot on is evaluation methods for health information systems and medical devices. And that's part the sort of practical, does this thing really work? Is it useful for all the different kind of communities and different situations? And can we reliably, trust this system in healthcare and in different situations? And so it's remarkable how few systems are really formally evaluated in the right ways. And just the simple basic ideas, you have to make sure that this is actually designed for the problem that people really have. And often people are coming up with a technology and then trying to fit it to something as opposed to looking at the problem at the beginning. And they often have those challenges where the system may not be designed to be usable. And then when it comes to systems that are actually being deployed, so often they don't actually have measured performance in the real world. And so, coming back to the real world situation, designing studies where you see people using a system, you can actually see whether it makes a difference, whether that difference is positive, whether it affects different groups. And so those combined skills across a range of different things, obviously statistics and clinical trial design, but also thinking about how do different people interact with technology. Because if you don't do those type of projects and make sure that they have gone through the right steps, you end up with systems that tend to be either difficult to use or potentially unsafe. And unfortunately, we see a lot of that. And so, one of the advantages of this course now is that almost every week we see some great disaster of a health information system, and the students can look at it and say, well, they didn't do steps 3, 5, and 7, because they were very clearly didn't evaluate, for example, usability in electronic health records. It became a huge disaster. It was all over the news and the New York Times and stuff because physicians were so unhappy, but they hadn't done the basics, which wasn't that expensive, but it's these kind of things that are surprising, but often the problems we see with technology are really anticipated, the people have not applied the appropriate methods rather than it being some unexpected surprise,
Yeah, and I'll just lastly say that, ultimately this is what makes Brown so magic for this, but I think it's about thinking about the problem as opposed to your disciplinary silo, right? I think, I'm an oddball because I'm a communication scholar, but I'm sitting in a school of public health. And I think I see people studying AI for health, and then I see they studying it for democracy, and then I see it studying for... And actually what we need to do, and what I think Brown is so well set up to do, is to think about what are the problems and how can people come at those problems from their transdisciplinary perspectives. And I think if we did that, then the university would really be pushing forward, because my worry is that universities, as they're set up now, are not set up to really answer the challenges that AI are presenting with us, because we're still like, oh, this is what I do. And I think it's about tearing down those boundaries.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's great. Really good point.
Yeah, I think facing the problem head on instead of backing away or retreating to a disciplinary sort of comfort zone is a really important thing with AI.
Great, shall we transition to some of the questions that you've all submitted through the QR code? Can you speak about the implicit biases in the training data of these models? How do we rectify these biases in a controlled and careful way? Great question.
You're the statistician.
Yeah. Okay, I'll start from my own space. Yeah, so, okay, I think about this question a lot. In genetics, there's this really famous figure that Sohini and I put probably on all of our slides, which is this idea of who enrolls in these studies and ancestral breakdowns. So you think about systems like the UK Biobank, which is heavily skewed towards one ancestry population, and you think all the things that we know about genetic architecture might be heavily skewed to this group of people. So what does that mean for our ability to do precision medicine well? We think about this in cancer genomics as well. We get a lot of samples from Dana-Farber, and so we're thinking about how to build models that recapitulate human biology, but I ask myself a lot of this question now because I hang out with people who are anthropologists. Where's this data coming from? And the chances are that people who we're taking these tissues from probably don't look like me is probably something to think about. So yeah, there's a lot of these issues. What I've also learned, though, in our ability to be more inclusive in who we enroll in these studies are a lot of other further questions, right? How do you not further exacerbate other distrusts in systems, right? And so there's this really famous term that I like to use called predatory inclusion. This idea like you don't want to include people in the study just for the sake of including them as a number, right? You want to think about the communities that you're giving back to, and am I using my model for a purpose that will actually serve them? And so that pressures us as researchers to think about that next question or the previous question or where you're looking at it. And so, to answer that is a long-winded way of saying I don't actually know how we fully get rid of some of these biases. Obviously, we need to think about diversity and heterogeneity across many different axes and scales. The way I think you do that is from a experimental design perspective. You need to have experts in other areas, I think, help you with that initial experimental design. To me, the way you do AI really well in healthcare is it has to be almost like a reinforcement learning problem in the way that, I work on a problem, I think about how that affects a given community or target population. That target population then tells me whether or not that worked or didn't work for them, and then I update my model based on this kind of loop. And the way that this has to work is that my reward system has to suffer if their reward system is not maximized, right? And so to me, that's the way that you really get rid of that kind of bias. But again, this takes communities really working together. The start of my question, you have to be in a system where everyone is somehow able to break down these barriers and able to work together, both on a research perspective and an institutional perspective as well.
So I think as we move to universal health information systems, then you are able to start looking at the way that people present and the way people are managed in different communities. And so, the UK is a good example because there are a number, it's not as diverse in terms of population as a lot of other countries, but what it does have is almost 100% inclusion of everybody who needs care. So you get a different slice. So the gaps in the US system are much, much bigger in terms of access to care, but maybe smaller in terms of diversity, particularly in some cities. So if you start to look at different slices in different systems, then hopefully we start to be able to triangulate, what are the gaps? Because certainly you can't compare, especially with socioeconomic status, you cannot compare systems that are excluding people who can't afford health insurance, for example. That completely blows away the meaning of your model, I think, and because so much of healthcare risk is attached to low socioeconomic status and the disadvantage that people feel. I think also that we are seeing more kind of attention to communities around the world. So, for example, a lot of my work is in low and middle income countries, developing electronic health records and collecting data, for example, in Kenya at the AMPAF project. And we're testing machine learning models to try and predict people who are going to miss patient visits at the moment. So we're collecting every single patient consult, and we're monitoring that on a weekly basis, and we're looking at the models, and we're trying to see if the models are actually tracking it correctly to sort of build a system that will try and include everybody, and then we can see whether what we're doing is working from year to year, for example, or is working in some communities that may be different in some way because of their access to care.
And just quickly, it also comes back to literacy. Like, we need more people to understand that something is being predicted on the basis of an algorithm, and so then people are going to ask questions. A friend of mine, Hilke Schillerman, has done a lot of work about recruitment algorithms. In the famous example, I can't remember which state it was, but they had this training model about who was going to make a good teacher, and it was all of these characteristics, and one of them was like people called Peter, right? Until somebody was like, I think the name has got absolutely nothing to do. You just need more literacy, you need more eyeballs, you need more interdisciplinarity to be like, that's crazy, right? And I think at the moment, too much of this is hidden, and not enough people are able to kick the tires and be like, you've made a mistake there.
Thank you. This question, I think, relates to something you said, Claire, when you were entering in, pretending you had a heart attack, and it was asking for your weight and height and age. The question is, how can data from individuals' daily lives improve AI from healthcare, notably wearable sensors or watches, et cetera, and self-reported data types? So kind of to the point of it, if there's no product, you're the product. But on the upside, what is that all doing for us? All the information we're feeding in. How can that be used for the good?
I can kick off if you want. I mean, clearly, a lot of the data that's been collected from sensors, people were using heart rate monitoring, even EKG monitoring, pulse oximetry, and so on. That information can be quite valuable in determining long-term health. But it has that problem that it's a very big information overload. So the Apple Watch, when it started monitoring people's EKG, picked up a few patients with irregular heartbeats, so atrial fibrillation, but enormous numbers of false positives, and it was very difficult to actually use that information effectively. So you do need a lot of context. And I think, so in our studies, we are actually looking at vital signs data. We're looking at information about what medications are on, for example. That's not normally used by the symptom checkers, but if we can look at that and see whether it may actually make a significant difference to the performance, there are things that can be collected at home. So exactly with an Apple Watch or something, which I think will be helpful. And the other piece of this, which is interesting, is that a lot of the figures we've given, for example, blood pressures and heart rates and so on, they're based on tiny studies in one or two places. The typical machines that measure your blood pressure, where they blow out the cuff in your arm, they were all designed on like a few hundred patients in the US about 50 years ago. And there's a tiny slice of the population. And so now we've got huge quantities of that data. It turns out that there's a huge range. And so people vary by sex, by age, by disease, by all sorts of things. And so that information is very helpful in actually giving us better ranges and what we should expect. And whether a patient is actually normal or abnormal is a little easier to tell now.
I remember in the early days of the pandemic, there was a maker of a digital thermometer that was able to produce the fever maps of the country, and there was an effort to try to connect that to where the pandemic was going and how it was going up and down. That felt like an early example. Does anybody remember that or have any thoughts of how that worked or doesn't work, or what the promise of that level of information is for health?
I mean, there was the famous Yankee Candle Googling, right, for people who having COVID who couldn't
to
smell
check
their
and see if
candle
they could
anymore.
smell. Yeah.
I mean, I guess not to insert myself into this talented panel, but thinking, about the different work everyone does, I think data integration is just, I mean, more information doesn't mean always more insight, for sure. And I think that's exactly, part of what Hamish is pointing out. But certainly, like the National Human Genome Research Institute's vision for personalized medicine has shifted a lot to the integration with wearables, the integration of not just inherited germline genetics, but also genomic data and wearables as a way to get kind of a fuller, more contextual picture. And, even things like Google searches can sometimes be a part of that, but I don't know what you all think about it.
Well, I mean, I think part of the problem is for the last 10 years, people have just felt that their data has just been abused to such a degree that, when that question, I was like, oh yeah, data donation. If I felt like that was going to a publicly owned company that was going to do good things, right, I'm just not going to hand over my, and I think that's a real issue. Like, what would it mean if we were having a conversation right now for us deciding to be part of a much bigger society-wide AI project for good? Like, I think, if we hadn't had the last 10 years, there might be more people who are open to that. But I think people are done and kind of disgusted about how they've lost control. And, we know this from students when we're like, how do you feel about being surveyed and then being hyper-targeted? And students go, ugh, because they've grown up with this way of just like, I've got no control over my data. So, but I hadn't really thought about it in the context of what it would mean to build better systems that were more representative. And so now I just feel sad.
So there's a nice, simple example in Scotland a few years ago where they were trying to decide how you could provide access to people's medication histories when they were receiving emergency care. And so they set up a system that they thought would be able to collect the medication data from all the primary care records that everybody in the country has. And that would then be accessible to the emergency departments and to physicians if you're, for example, urgent care in primary care. And what they did then was they had a public consultation. They said, how much support was this for this idea, and after much discussion, they decided that they would do an opt-out process because most people were supportive. That if you sort of saw somebody in, say, emergency department, that they would have to get verbal consent at the time to access your record, and that you could opt out. And about 18,000 out of 5 million people opted out. And it was a very kind of open process, and people were really happy with it. And then they added palliative care data and a few other things in a very kind of deliberate process. But of course, this was a healthcare system and wasn't social media. But it was a really great sort of confidence-building process where you had these controls and ability to opt out at different stages.
Thank you. I think we're time for one more question. And this one relates to the previous questions and a lot of the things you said before. How would you recommend holding companies, AI companies, accountable for speaking with communities and providing proper answers to patients, especially with respect to misinformation? So holding yeah, go for it. Thank you.
Well, I'll try and make it short. I mean, clearly we have to have control. And when Isaac Harney gave his talk at the medical school about a couple of months ago, he's one of the pioneers of this work over many years. And his point was we're basically losing control of all of this new technologies to giant tech companies. And we have to, as both the medical profession and the nursing profession and the public in general, have to fight to get that back. Because increasingly the technology and the scale of the training systems needed is all in the hands of a few private companies, and they have clearly not got a good track record. So for something as important as healthcare, we have to put in those guardrails. We have to have penalties that really make a difference, and proper regulation. I think it's extremely important. And if we don't get control of this now, it'll become increasingly dangerous because it'll be very, very hard to pull back. Because once people rely on these tools, even if they're not working great, it's very hard to then pull that out.
And what I find fascinating is in the social media world, we have Section 230, right, which basically from 1996 said that the platforms aren't liable for whatever we post on, Facebook and be like, oh, we're just the pipes, we're not a publisher. But when it comes to LLMs, that when we think about intent in this country, I mean, there's a lot of lawyers. I can't believe that we're not going to have a case pretty soon when some model gives some advice, which somebody takes a behavior based on that advice, and something terrible happens, and then the court system gets involved. Because we can't have Section 230 protections, I don't think, in the context of this. And I find it astonishing that they are launching these models with no guardrails in a country that likes to sue each other. But I'm not a lawyer.
I guess as a person that works for one of these big things,
Yeah.
relationship with London. No, I think also a big thing is also going to be internal processes as well, right? Like there has to be some internal governance structure. And so I think that also has to be kind of like a mandate, right? And I've seen it personally, like at a place like Microsoft, where these things come in handy when you get to that stage, right? You start to, if there's you're self-governing and you think about internal checks and balances, I think that also plays a massive role in this. And so that has to be, I think, also a mandate as well.
Because a judge will have to rule whether that caveat that says, we're giving you this information, but you should also check with your healthcare provider, a judge will have to decide, is that caveat strong enough?
Right.
Well,
I think Air Canada got burnt on that one, right, for recommending the flight that was incorrect, the price of the flight, and they had to pay compensation because their chatbot told them.
Oh yeah, Air Canada, but also Mayor Adams in New York had to say that their chatbot was giving illegal advice to small businesses. So we're about to have something in healthcare, I think.
That's not good either.
Well, thank you so much. Let's take a moment to thank our wonderful panelists. And thank you all for being here. We can continue the conversation outside in the atrium. There's a lovely reception, some nibbles, and these wonderful people will be there to chat a bit more. So, thank you.
Thank you.